Welcome, everyone. This channel isn't just about me, it's about us. A place where we share ideas, connect, and grow together through every video. If you want to be part of a positive and supportive community, hit subscribe and let's build something great together.
I grew up in a suburb of Charlotte, North Carolina, the kind of neighborhood where every house looks roughly the same and everyone waves at each other from their driveways on Saturday mornings. My father worked in logistics for 30 years, methodical and steady. The kind of man who kept the same coffee mug for 2 decades because it still worked fine. My mother taught 3rd grade and made everything feel manageable, even when it wasn't. Growing up between the two of them, I learned that love was less about grand gestures and more about showing up, day after day, without being asked. I met my wife at a company happy hour when I was 28. She was standing near the back of the bar, laughing at something her colleague had said. And I remember thinking she had the kind of laugh that made a room feel warmer. Her name was Claire. She was a project manager at a firm downtown, sharp and organized. With a competitive streak she wore openly and a tenderness she kept mostly hidden. We dated for 2 years before I proposed on a hiking trail outside Asheville. She cried. I cried. A couple walking their dog passed us and clapped. It was embarrassing and perfect. We built a life together the way most people do, slowly, with a lot of IKEA furniture and arguments about paint colors and Sunday mornings that eventually became the best part of my week. Our son Ethan came along 4 years into our marriage. I was 34. I remember standing in the hospital hallway after he was born, completely unable to speak, just leaning against the wall with my hands on my knees, trying to remember how breathing worked. I had never loved anything the way I loved that child from the first moment I saw him. Claire was extraordinary during those early years. Patient, instinctive, good with him in ways I was still learning to be. I looked at our family and felt, with genuine certainty, that I had done something right. By the time Ethan was 7, Claire had been promoted twice and was managing a team of 12. I was a senior financial analyst at a mid-sized firm, steady and well-regarded, not flashy but dependable. We had a house in a good school district, a dog named Briggs, weekend barbecues with the neighbors, and a marriage that felt, from the outside and mostly from the inside, like something solid. Looking back, I can see that I was reading the surface and missing the current running underneath it. I thought routine was comfort. I didn't understand that for Claire, routine had become a slow suffocation. I came home on a Tuesday in October to find her sitting at the kitchen island with a glass of wine she hadn't touched, and her laptop open to a document she closed the moment I walked in. There was something in the air, something I couldn't name but immediately felt in my chest. She didn't get up. She didn't say hello. She just looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not anger exactly, but something colder. Resolved. She told me she wanted a divorce. She said the marriage had run its course, and that she needed more than I was capable of giving her. She said she had been unhappy for a long time and that she was sorry she hadn't said it sooner. She was calm, measured, like she had rehearsed it, which I later understood she had. I sat down at the island across from her and I asked her if there was someone else. She looked away. That was my answer. I didn't yell, I didn't throw anything. I just felt the whole room tilt, like the floor had shifted 2 inches to the left, and everything I thought was level was suddenly wrong. I asked her who it was. She said it was someone from her office. I asked how long. She said 4 months. I asked if Ethan knew anything. She said no. I nodded slowly and told her I needed some air, and I walked out the back door and sat in the yard in the dark for 2 hours while Briggs pressed his head into my lap and the neighbors' lights went out one by one. I did not fall apart that night. I want to be clear about that, because what came later required me to not fall apart. I sat in that yard and I made a decision, a conscious, deliberate decision, that I was not going to let this destroy me or my son or the life I had spent 15 years building. I was angry, yes. I was devastated. But underneath the devastation was something harder and quieter, and I chose to stand on that. The next morning, before Claire was awake, I called my older brother Daniel. He was a family law attorney in Atlanta, one of the best in the state, and he had handled enough divorces to know exactly what needed to happen in the first 72 hours. I told him everything. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Don't move out of that house. Don't sign anything. Don't say anything to her about finances. I'm coming up this weekend." I said, "Okay." He said, "I mean it, James. Nothing. Not a word." I said I understood. I want to tell you about Marcus because he matters to this story and because I didn't understand how much he mattered until later. Marcus had been my closest friend for 11 years. We had met at a conference in DC when we were both junior analysts trying to make sense of the same spreadsheet, and we had kept in touch through job changes and moves and everything in between. He was Ethan's godfather. He had been at my wedding. When I picture the best years of my adult life, Marcus is in almost every memory. Backyard cookouts, weekend football, the fishing trip we took every September to a lake outside Boone. He was the kind of friend you assumed would always be there, the way you assume certain things are permanent until the day they prove you wrong. I called him that same morning, right after I got off the phone with Daniel. I told him what had happened with Claire. He was quiet for a long moment, then said, "Man, I'm so sorry. That's brutal." He asked if I needed him to come over. I said not yet. He said to call him anytime, day or night. I thanked him. I hung up feeling slightly less alone. Daniel arrived that Saturday with a notepad and a quiet fury he kept carefully controlled. He sat at my kitchen table after Ethan was in bed and walked me through everything. What I was entitled to, what Claire was likely to pursue, what the landscape looked like for custody given that I had been Ethan's primary caregiver during the years when Claire's career had consumed most of her evenings. He asked me questions I didn't have answers to yet and told me to start finding them. He asked me for access to our joint accounts so he could document the balances. He asked if I had noticed any unusual transactions. I hadn't looked. I pulled up the account on my laptop while Daniel sat beside me, and we went through the last 6 months together. There were charges at restaurants I'd never been to, a hotel stay in Raleigh I hadn't known about, and several transfers to an account I didn't recognize. Not enormous sums, but consistent, deliberate. Daniel wrote down every line without comment and then closed his notepad and said, "Okay, here's what we're going to do." The next few weeks were strange in the particular way that double lives are strange. Everything on the surface looked almost normal while everything underneath was moving. Claire and I were civil to each other for Ethan's sake, careful and distant, like two people sharing an office after a bad meeting. She had told me she was staying in the house until we worked out the legal details, which Daniel had advised me to allow for the time being. I cooked dinner most nights. I helped Ethan with his homework. I coached his Saturday soccer practice the same as always, standing on the sideline in the cold with my coffee, watching my son sprint toward a goal, trying to keep my face from showing any of what was happening inside me. It was during one of those Saturday practices that the second piece of the story fell into place. One of the other dads, a guy named Greg who worked downtown in the same general orbit as Claire's firm, came and stood next to me on the sideline. We talked about the kids for a while. Then, in the way that people in small cities sometimes do, he mentioned a name, her colleague, the one I had identified as the person Claire had been seeing. He mentioned it casually, as part of a sentence about someone he'd seen at a bar. He didn't know what he was telling me. I kept my expression completely neutral and asked a few careful questions, and by the end of the conversation I had learned that this man was not just Claire's colleague, but her immediate supervisor. He was married. His wife's name was Diane. She managed a design studio on the south side of Charlotte, and by all accounts had no idea what her husband had been doing. I drove home from that practice with Ethan singing something from the radio in the back seat, and I sat with what I had learned for 4 days before I decided what to do with it. I want to be precise about my intentions, because I have thought about this many times since. I did not contact Diane out of revenge. I contacted her because I would have wanted to know. I would have wanted someone to tell me. I found her studio's website, found her email address listed on the contact page, and I wrote her a message that took me 2 hours to compose. I told her who I was. I told her what I knew. I told her I had no interest in making her life difficult, that I was sorry to be the one telling her, and that I was available to talk as she wanted to. I attached 2 pieces of documentation that Daniel had already flagged during his review of our accounts, a hotel receipt and a restaurant charge that corresponded to a night I knew her husband had told her he was traveling for work because he had mentioned it to Claire, and Claire had mentioned it to me before any of this happened. I sent the email and then I didn't sleep for most of that night. She called me the next morning at 7:15. Her voice was steadier than I expected. She said she had read my email 3 times. She said she had known something was wrong for months but had told herself she was imagining it. She asked me a few questions. I answered them honestly. At the end of the call she said, "Thank you. I know this wasn't easy for you either." I said it wasn't. She said she was sorry about my marriage. I said I was sorry about hers. We hung up. What happened on Diane's end of things unfolded without my involvement, but Daniel, who had a wider professional network than I did, gave me updates as they reached him. She had confronted her husband within 48 hours. He had denied it, then confirmed it, then tried to minimize it in the way that people do when the evidence makes denial impossible. Diane had filed for divorce within the week. She had also And this part Daniel told me with a particular expression I had never seen on his face before. Reported the relationship to Claire's firm's HR department because her husband was Claire's direct supervisor, and the relationship constituted a clear violation of workplace policy. Claire was placed on administrative leave pending a review. I found out on a Wednesday evening when she came home from a meeting with her HR department and sat down at the kitchen island, the same stool, the same posture, and told me what had happened. She said it was my fault. She said I had gone out of my way to destroy her career on top of everything else. I let her finish. Then I said, I contacted Diane because she had a right to know. The same right I had. What happened after that was between her and her firm. Claire's face went through several expressions very quickly. Then she said, you knew exactly what you were doing. I said, yes. I contacted her because it was the right thing to do. Every decision after that was made by other people. I walked upstairs, and that was the last real conversation we had that wasn't conducted through attorneys. The review lasted 3 weeks. Claire was ultimately not terminated but was moved to a different team and stripped of her managerial role. Her colleague resigned before the process concluded. The professional and financial consequences were significant, and because they landed during the middle of our divorce proceedings, they affected the settlement picture considerably. Daniel was methodical and thorough in a way that I found deeply comforting during a period when almost nothing else was. He documented everything. He established Ethan's primary residence patterns through school records, medical records, and testimony from Ethan's teachers and our pediatrician, all of whom confirmed that I had been the parent managing the day-to-day. He filed motions I didn't entirely understand but trusted completely. When Claire's attorney made demands that Daniel found unreasonable, he responded not with emotion but with documentation, and the demands were quietly retracted one by one. Ethan knew something was wrong. Children always do. I told him in the way that Daniel and a family therapist I had started seeing both recommended, simply, without blame, focused on what would stay the same. I told him that his mother and I were going to live in different houses, but that he would always have both of us, that we both loved him completely, and that none of what was happening was because of anything he had done. He was quiet for a while, then asked if Briggs would have to choose. I told him Briggs would stay with me but visit his mother on the weekends. He seemed to find this reasonable. Kids have a way of identifying the truly important elements of a situation. I need to tell you about the Marcus part now, because I have been putting it off, and it doesn't get easier by waiting. 6 weeks into the divorce proceedings, I was going through a second pass of our joint accounts with Daniel when we found a pattern that hadn't registered the first time because we had been looking at larger amounts. Small transfers, $50 or $100 at a time, to a Venmo account. Consistent timing, always within 48 hours of a date on my calendar. A night Claire had told me she was working late. A weekend I had taken Ethan to visit my parents. The account was listed under a name I didn't recognize, but Daniel had a contact at a firm that did digital forensics for family law cases, and within a week we had traced the account. It belonged to Marcus. I sat with that information for 3 days. I didn't call him. I didn't text him. I went back through the timeline in my head with this new piece of information, and things that had seemed like coincidence rearranged themselves into a pattern I wished I couldn't see. The times he had known about our schedule without me telling him, the slight awkwardness I had occasionally noticed and dismissed as nothing. The call, the morning after I told him about the divorce when he had said all the right things with the particular fluency of someone who was not surprised. On the 4th day, I drove to his apartment on the Sunday afternoon. He buzzed me up. When he opened the door and saw my face, he knew immediately. I could see it. He stepped back and let me in, and we stood in his living room, and I said, very quietly, "Tell me how long." He looked at the floor. He said 3 months. I asked if Claire had told him what she was planning before she told me. He said yes. I asked if he had tried to talk her out of it or considered telling me. He didn't answer. I left after about 5 minutes. I didn't raise my voice. There was nothing to say that would change anything, and I knew that rage was not what the situation required from me. I drove home, picked up Ethan from the neighbor's house where he'd been playing, made grilled cheese for dinner, and helped him practice his multiplication tables until bedtime. Then I sat on the back porch in the cold with Briggs, and I let myself feel the full weight of it. All of it, in the quiet and the dark where Ethan couldn't see. I blocked Marcus on everything. I did not explain myself. I did not give him the chance to apologize, not because I was trying to punish him, but because there was nothing he could say that I needed to hear. 11 years of friendship, and he had chosen to be the person who let me call him the morning after my marriage collapsed, and said all the right things while knowing exactly what he had done. Some things don't have a conversation. Some things you just close the door on and walk away. The divorce was finalized 6 months after Claire and I had that first conversation at the kitchen island. I received primary physical custody of Ethan. Claire received liberal visitation. The settlement was significantly less favorable to her than she had initially demanded, in part because of the financial irregularities Daniel had documented and in part because of the changed professional circumstances. She kept her car and a portion of our savings. I kept the house and the dog and our son's school calendar. The morning the papers were signed, Daniel took me out for breakfast at a diner near his hotel. He ordered the same thing he always orders: eggs over easy, wheat toast, black coffee. And he sat across from me and said, "You did this right, James." I didn't say anything for a minute. Then I said, "I didn't have a choice." He said, "You had 100 choices. You made the right ones." I looked out the window at the parking lot and thought about that. The first year afterward was the hardest, and also, in a strange way, the most clarifying year of my life. I was 41 years old, single, raising a 9-year-old, working full-time, and learning to cook more than 4 things. Ethan and I developed a rhythm together, just the 2 of us and Briggs, that I would not trade for anything. We made pancakes on Sunday mornings. We watched documentaries about animals and argued about which ones were the most misunderstood. He started playing guitar and I bought him a decent beginner's acoustic and sat through the first year of practice with a patience I did not know I possessed. He was, in every important way, the reason I held myself together during the months when holding together was genuinely difficult. I met Renee on a Saturday afternoon in late spring, about 14 months after the divorce was final. I was at a farmer's market near the park with Ethan, standing in line at a coffee stand, and she was in front of me trying to manage a bag of tomatoes, a sleeping toddler in a carrier on her chest, and a wallet that wouldn't cooperate. I held the tomatoes. She thanked me. We talked for about 10 minutes in the way that strangers sometimes do when circumstances briefly align them. She was a pediatric nurse practitioner recently moved to Charlotte from Nashville after her own divorce, raising her 3-year-old daughter Maya on her own. She had dark eyes and a directness I found immediately appealing, and a laugh that arrived without warning and took over her whole face. I asked if she wanted to get a coffee sometime. She looked at me for a moment, weighing something, the way people who have been through difficult things learn to do before they agree to anything, and then she said, "I would like that." We exchanged numbers. I walked away feeling lighter than I had in over a year. We went slowly, which was right for both of us. Coffee first, then dinner without the kids, then a Saturday afternoon with all 3 of them at a park, which was the real test, and which went better than either of us had dared to predict. Ethan and Maya took to each other with the straightforward ease that children sometimes manage and adults almost never do. He pushed her on the swings. She laughed at everything he did. I stood next to Renee watching them and felt something shift in me, some deep structural thing that had been braced against impact since October 2 years earlier, finally beginning to let go. Renee was not Claire. I mean that as a complete statement, not a comparison. She was warm in a way she didn't try to contain. She said what she thought. She had been through enough to know what mattered and what didn't, and she applied that knowledge unsentimental and consistently. She was honest with me in the early months in ways that required courage, about her fears, about her boundaries, about what she needed and what she couldn't give yet. I found that honesty more attractive than anything else about her. After years of reading a surface and missing everything underneath, I wanted someone whose interior was accessible. She gave me that. I tried to give it back. Daniel drove up from Atlanta the first time I brought Renee to a family dinner. He watched us for about 20 minutes, and then, in the kitchen while we were getting drinks, he said, "She's good." I said I knew. He said, "No, I mean, she's genuinely good. Like the thing you're looking for. She actually has it." I told him to stop being sentimental because it was making me uncomfortable. He laughed and carried the drinks back to the table. 2 years after I met her at the farmer's market, Renee and I got married in a small ceremony at a venue outside Charlotte. Ethan stood next to me at the altar. Maya was the flower girl and took her responsibilities very seriously, scattering petals with focused precision. Daniel gave a speech that made everyone laugh and then made me cry, which I did not fully forgive him for. Briggs was not invited because he had a known pattern of poor behavior at outdoor events, but he was waiting at home and was very pleased to see everyone when we returned. Claire came to Ethan's 12th birthday party, the first one after Renee and I were married, and it was the first time she and Renee were in the same space. Renee was gracious in the way that is not performance but genuine character, making sure Claire felt included, making sure Ethan could see both his parents present and functioning. I watched from across the yard and thought about all the choices that had led to this particular Saturday afternoon. The October kitchen island, the 72-hour call to Daniel, the farm market in May, all of it. And I felt neither triumph nor bitterness, just a steady, quiet sense of having landed somewhere honest. At some point during the party, Claire found me by the grill and said very quietly, so that no one around us could hear, "She's good for him." She meant Ethan. I said thank you. She looked at the yard for a moment, watching our son run around with his friends, and then she said, "You did a good job with him, James, through all of it." I didn't say anything immediately. Then I said I thought we both had in our separate ways. She nodded. She went back to the picnic table. That was the most honest conversation we had had in 3 years, and it cost neither of us anything. Her supervisor, the one she had left me for, had resigned from his firm during the HR review and had not, as far as I knew, found comparable employment. He and his wife Diane had finalized their divorce about 2 months after mine was complete. I had no ongoing contact with Diane, but a mutual acquaintance mentioned to Daniel that she had expanded her design studio, hired 2 additional staff, and seemed, by all visible measures, to be doing well. I found that genuinely satisfying. As for Marcus, he reached out once, about 8 months after I cut contact, through a mutual friend who relayed a message that he was sorry and wanted to talk. I thought about it for a few days. Then I said no. Not because I needed him to keep suffering, but because there was nothing that conversation could restore. Friendship, the real kind, is built on a foundation of basic trustworthiness, and that foundation was gone. Some losses you grieve and move through. Some you just accept and stop looking back. I think about the Tuesday in October sometimes, the tilted room, the kitchen island, the dark yard with Briggs, and I don't feel what I expected to feel when I look back on it. I thought, in those first weeks, that the story of my life had been broken in half, and that whatever came after would be defined by that break. What I understand now is that it was more like a clearing. Everything that had been obscured by the accumulated weight of years, who I actually was, what I needed, what I was capable of, who deserved to be close to me, became suddenly, sharply visible. The clarity was painful in the way that clarity after a long confusion is always painful. But I would not go back to the fog. Ethan is 15 now. He plays guitar well enough to perform at his school's winter concert, which Renee and I attend every year sitting next to Claire and her new partner, a quiet man who teaches high school history and seems to make her genuinely happy in ways I clearly never did. I have stopped trying to understand what she needed that I didn't provide. Not because the question isn't real, but because the answer no longer changes anything. What I know is that Ethan is a grounded, kind, perceptive kid who loves his family in all its complicated configurations, and that we managed, between us, to give him that. Maya calls me Dad. She has since she was 5. The first time she said it, I was in the kitchen making breakfast, and she just said it casually, passing through on her way to the backyard, and I stood there holding a spatula, unable to move for about 30 seconds. Renee was watching from the doorway. She smiled and didn't say anything, because she understood that some moments are more than words can hold, and she has always known when to simply let a moment exist. I am 46 years old. I work at a firm I respect with people I like. I come home to a house where someone is always glad to see me, usually including the dog. I coach Ethan's Saturday soccer from the same sideline with the same coffee, but everything it means to stand there has changed. I am not the man who came home to a tilted room on a Tuesday in October. I am the man that Tuesday made possible. The two things are not in contradiction. They are, I have come to understand, exactly the same story. There is something I have learned about the way consequences work that nobody warns you about when you are in the middle of the worst moment of your life. They do not arrive loudly. They do not announce themselves. They accumulate quietly, in direct proportion to the choices that cause them, and they land exactly where they belong. Claire made choices. She chose to betray a marriage of 15 years. She chose a man who was willing to lie to his own wife while asking her to lie to me. She chose to hide money, to plan in secret, to walk away from a family that was functioning and whole because something shinier had presented itself. And when I found out, I did not fall apart and I did not retaliate out of anger. I made one phone call to my brother and one honest email to a woman who deserved to know the truth. Every consequence that followed came from those two decisions, and those two decisions came from a single commitment I made to myself, sitting in a dark backyard on a Tuesday night, that I was going to handle this with my character intact. That is the thing I want you to understand. Intelligence in a moment of crisis is not about being clever. It is about being clear. I was clear about what mattered, my son, my integrity, the kind of man I wanted Ethan to see me be. I did not waste energy on rage or on trying to make Claire suffer. I used every ounce of my focus on building something solid enough to stand on. That is what intelligence looks like when the floor drops out from under you. And Marcus. Losing him was its own kind of grief, separate from the marriage, quieter but lasting in a different way. 11 years. I had believed, without ever questioning it, that he was someone I could trust with anything. What I understand now is that character is not what a person shows you when things are easy. It is what they do when the choice is hard and the cost of honesty is real. He failed that test completely, and I closed that door not in anger but in clarity, because I had learned, at considerable personal expense, that trust is not something you rebuild on a cracked foundation. What I did not expect, what genuinely surprised me, was how much the clearing would give back. I lost a marriage, a friendship, and a version of my life I had mistaken for permanent. What grew in that space was more honest than anything it replaced. Renee. The mornings with Ethan, the particular kind of peace that comes from knowing that everything you have, you built with your own hands and your own choices. Betrayal does not define you. How you carry it does. James lost what was false and found what was real. Not because the world is fair, but because he refused to become something small in response to something painful. He stayed large. He stayed honest. He stayed present for his son even on the nights when presence required everything he had. And the life that grew from that, the woman who says his name like it means something, the daughter who calls him dad without being asked, the son who watches him and learns what a man looks like when he decides to be one. That life is the direct result of the kind of person he chose to be when nobody would have blamed him for choosing differently. The floor will drop out for a lot of people. It dropped out for me. What matters is what you decide to do before you hit the ground.